Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Peter Riddle. I'm Director of the Institute for Government. Welcome to an event I wanted to have at the Institute for a long time with Carwyn Jones, the First Minister of Wales, not least because the Institute itself has taken a very active interest in what happens in Wales. Our view of devolution is not just about Scotland. It does embrace Wales considerably. I'm glad to see there are officials here from the Welsh Government whom we have very close relations with. And indeed, as director, I think I've been to Cardiff, well, I know I've been to Cardiff several times more frequently as director than I ever did in 30 years as a journalist, which perhaps says something about Westminster-based journalists as well as anything else. We're aware of the changes going on in Wales, which raised some very interesting questions about the governance of the UK. And I'm particularly glad that Carwyn's here because he has been talking about it in a big speech some time ago of looking at the UK-wide dimension, which is absolutely central to it. And also, he's particularly interesting because he, when he's about to be joined by Nicola Sturgeon, is the first generation of leaders of the devolved nations who've never had a career at Westminster. Alex Salmond, of course, did. And rather more complicated, of course, in Belfast, their background, but the first who's not been a Westminster MP. And I think that underlines the differences in political culture which are emerging in Cardiff and now Edinburgh. Obviously, post the Scottish referendum, the debate has widened, but the debate has widened not just to the English question, it's actually a UK question. And that's why the speech today is so timely, because it really is raising the issues of what is the place of the devolved nations, as they are, and of England within the UK as a whole. And that's what I'm particularly looking forward to hearing from Carwyn Jones.
Well, thank you, Peter, and good afternoon to you all. It's a great pleasure to be with you here in the Institute for Government, where, of course, many issues of governance and accountability have been discussed over the years. Peter was right to say that I think I'm the only First Minister not to have had a career at Westminster. It's not something I particularly regret at this stage. And certainly, perhaps more startlingly, the only First or Prime Minister there has ever been who went to a comprehensive school. Something that is quite remarkable given the social profile of the UK as a whole. Now, I know that constitutional reform is a bit of a minority interest amongst the public. That much we have to understand, and I've been talking about it now for many years. It was a struggle to get people to understand the importance of having a sensible and established position well before the Scottish vote, something, of course, that didn't happen. Then, of course, we had the referendum, and suddenly the union and the nature of the union was centre stage. So now we face a new reality. After the referendum, can we meet the challenge of reforming the union? Or do we do the minimum necessary to honour the pledges given to Scotland and hope that the problem goes away? That's the issue that I'd like to address today. The fundamental point that I'll make will be, let's stop talking about devolution, whether to Scotland or Wales or Northern Ireland, and let's start thinking about the future of the union, the future of the new union. And that, of course, means looking at what that means for England as well. First question, why? Well, we know that devolution has already fundamentally changed the governance of the United Kingdom. That was clear before the Scottish referendum took place, and it's become pretty obvious since then. Public support for the devolved parliament and assemblies has created a presumption of popular sovereignty in different parts of the UK, which has fundamentally challenged assumptions about a centralised British state. That is so much the case that I believe we should stop talking about devolution in terms of what powers can be handed down by a reluctant Whitehall and start talking about the new union and the issues we must share with each other. And the referendum campaign and the aftermath of it has demonstrated this. Now, let me put my cards on the table. I believe in the United Kingdom, but it needs to change. Not the old union, the new union. I want change for the very reason that I want the component parts of the UK to stay together. People travelling freely, trading freely, sharing the institutions that we have built together. I was relieved when the people of Scotland voted to reject independence and remain within the UK. A clear vote, though not an overwhelming vote. But the result of the referendum was clear, with a greater than 10-point gap in favour of the no side. But we cannot ignore the momentum that is still there towards further devolution. Now, as far as Wales is concerned, we've never been interested in independence. I've no desire to see a separate Welsh pound. There hasn't been one since 1908. We're not planning to print another one. We value Britain's common defence and our contribution on the international stage. And events in Scotland have emphatically not led to a separatist surge in Wales. If anything, it appears that people in Wales have seen what was taking place in Scotland and concluded that we are, in last month's terminology, better together. That's not to say, of course, that sometimes the media aren't too quick to think that Wales is or ought to be a mini Scotland, always running to catch up with our Celtic cousins. If Scotland is considering leaving the UK, then surely Wales would want to do the same. And when Wales fails to fit that convenient template, then the explanation has to be that there's something wrong with us. We lack ambition, we are timid, we are missing the chance to shape and create our own destiny. But then we realised it isn't easy being Welsh. For years we've put up with football commentators who refer to the English team as we. We saw the interchangeability of the terms English and British. The newspapers we read are mainly printed in London and don't cover in the main what happens in Wales. They do publish Scottish and Northern Irish editions. They don't publish Welsh editions. For years our language was ignored, or worse, we're not represented on the flag of the state that we're part of. And even Lord Ashcroft recently described Cardiff Central constituency as an English marginal. Always goes down very well in our capital city, but he did say that. Now, before I turn into a younger version of R.S. Thomas, and for those of you who know Welsh literature in English, he was not known for his fun, shall we say. I don't want to turn to somebody who's consistently moaning. I should add now that Wales's cultural identity is strong and is thriving. The fact that it survived a period when we had virtually no national institutions is remarkable. But that's why, of course, we reject the binary choice, having to choose whether we are Welsh or British. It's a false choice. We're Welsh, British and European. Welsh for the Six Nations, emphatically. British for the Olympics, European for the Ryder Cup. Multiple identities, worn quite happily at different times. But of course, what we're discussing today is more than about sport and culture. In the last stages of the independence campaign, I went to Scotland to put the spotlight on the social case for the Union. And Gordon Brown made those arguments the feature of the last days of the campaign. In essence, he said that the case for the Union on the basis of social citizenship and solidarity is strong. For Wales, this issue is critical because it's a project that we identify with completely and feel a part of. Throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, we were heavily involved in movements for reform. These battles for democracy, for trade union rights, for basic living standards had a Welsh dimension, but they were part of a broader canvas. We worked to build a better Wales and a better Britain, side by side with others in the UK. And that's why I believe that independence holds little appeal in Wales. Our battles were never for Wales alone. We wanted to see improvements in the lives of ordinary people through the solidarity of people working together for the common good. And we are now in a situation, of course, where we are part of the UK, a voluntary union of 4 nations, a union that is consented to by the overwhelming majority of the people of Wales. That's not a craven or a supine position. It's based on a cool collective analysis of our vital interests in Wales. That said, there is growing support for Wales to take greater control of its own affairs. In 1997, we had a referendum. People voted yes. Just over 6,700 votes was the majority. We had another one in 2011. People voted 2-1 in favour of far more powers for the National Assembly, and the opinion polls point to those powers being increased in the minds of the people of Wales in the future. In a nutshell, we don't want to undermine the solidarity and citizenship that link us to the rest of the UK, but we want to be able to respond to the needs of Wales in line with our political values. And, at the expense of trying your patience, I have to insist that we want and need to be able to do this within an overall financial settlement that is demonstrably fair to ourselves and fair to the rest of the UK, including, of course, the English regions. So, financial reform. Financial reform is key to ensuring a stable and lasting union. The current funding system that operates, the Barnett formula, as many of you will know, makes no attempt to answer the most fundamental question. That is, how much does each nation, and indeed English region, actually need to spend in order to deliver its public services? Instead, the formula rolls forward an arbitrary baseline established in the 1970s and adjusted only for population size. It's frankly the constitutional equivalent of fixing a hole in the roof with blue tack and cardboard. And Lord Barnett himself, of course, is one of the least complimentary about the formula that still bears his name. He celebrated his 91st birthday, I think it was yesterday or the day before, and perhaps the best belated present he could have would be a new system of providing fair funding to the constituent parts of the UK. The UK state has done an amazing job in managing to ignore this problem for over 30 years, but if there's going to be a lasting settlement that can secure support of citizens in all parts of the UK, then it has to be addressed. The shoulder shrug that we've had in the past does nobody any good. By far the best solution from a UK perspective would be for the funding of the devolved administrations and the regions of England too to be put on a new basis with an assessment of needs at its core. Now that shouldn't be in principle controversial. Needs-based funding simply means that the distribution of resources across the UK takes account of factors such as demography and health status. After all, it's one of the fundamental principles of the Union that money is distributed to where it is needed at that moment in time. This is not about special pleading for Wales, nor is it about saying to Scotland, give us your money. It's about ensuring there's a fair settlement for everybody. It's about recognising that all parts of the UK are entitled to a fair share, no more and no less. We're not handing out the begging bowl. We contributed greatly to the prosperity of the UK through coal, through steel, through tin plate and slate. Is it unreasonable then to ask that we should receive a fair share of the pot? No. It doesn't apply just to us. It applies to many other parts of the UK as well. Now in politics, of course, you can never let the best be the enemy of the good. Given that the Prime Minister is reported to have ruled out any changes in the future, that shows to me that there isn't a recognition of the need for change, but it is a recognition, of course, that there are significant barriers to change. So, if Barnett reform isn't on the cards, then my priority has to be to secure a fair deal for Wales within the present architecture. There's a perfectly straightforward proposition on the table involving an adjustment to the formula as applied to Wales. It would take away the inbuilt tendency to drive our relative funding levels ever downwards. I'll spare you the technicalities, I promise you, but it's called a funding floor. It would go a long way to securing a stable basis to devolution finance in Wales. So, I believe that financial reform is in the best interests not just of Wales, but of the whole of the United Kingdom. Once achieved, it's then perfectly sensible for devolved governments to take on greater responsibility for raising their own resources. The point I've made is we could not consider taking on board tax varying powers in Wales unless the issue of underfunding is addressed. Because it would simply lock in the underfunding. Every time we would raise the issue of the underfunding, we would be told you've got your own powers, raise your own money. And that is not clearly in the interests of the people of Wales. Now, as somebody who's instinctively pro-devolution, I can't object to moving towards financial or greater financial autonomy for Wales or Scotland. I also welcome England joining that journey, if that's the wish of the people of England. But if this is handled badly, tax devolution has the potential to cause havoc with the integrity of the UK. As a believer in the UK and in fairness, I recognise that many taxes are better run from the centre on a pan-UK basis. There are, for example, dangers in devolving corporation tax, for example, to some parts of the UK but not to others. And also a general devolution of corporation tax might lead to a race to the bottom where no one has an advantage but everybody has a 10-year hole in their own public finances. Little advantage there for anybody. We have to avoid giving permanent tax advantages to different nations, leading again to damaging perceptions of unfairness. Unfettered tax and spend autonomy would create a situation where the poorest areas have the worst public services. It's essential to keep that element of redistribution within the UK tax system. That would ride roughshod over equity and needs and would present real risks to the union's stability and cohesion. That said, there is a good case to my mind that different parts of the UK should be able to influence the balance between levels of personal taxation and levels of funding for public services, provided, of course, they bear the cost of variation. Partial devolution of income tax, if underpinned by a fair financial settlement, might be one way of achieving that. But more radically, in time, we may want to look at fundamentally restructuring our tax system, drawing lessons from countries like Germany. For example, it makes sense to me to have a pan-UK solidarity tax, which is the redistributive element of the tax system, to ensure that equity across the union, along with extensive devolved flexibility to top up or reduce certain tax rates in line with local preferences. You keep the flexibility, but you also keep, of course, the redistributive element that is so crucial to the existence of the UK. Now, I've spoken at length on finance because it's critical in enabling us to deliver for the people who elected us. But let me briefly address one key aspect of the other side of the coin. It remains to be seen whether devolution of welfare powers will be on the table for Scotland and indeed for Wales. But whatever is on offer, we will have to weigh very carefully the benefits and risks. Without financial reform and a proper transfer of resources, the transfer of power is empty. It's one thing to have the power to do something. If you don't have the money to actually implement that power, then the power is in itself useless. Quite apart from the financial pros and cons, we should also think very carefully about why exactly specific benefits should be proposed for devolution. In recent weeks, a number of people, and I'm one of them, have spoken about establishing home rule for Scotland or Wales. Not independence, but a recognition that the devolution and the split of powers rests in the hands of the people of Scotland, Wales, England and Northern Ireland. Now that language, of course, was first used long ago, before government accepted responsibility for establishing universal systems of social protection for all citizens in the UK, before the welfare state was created. If we are to move to a modern form of home rule, we must be careful that it doesn't serve to undermine that enormously important achievement. The welfare state establishes a certain set of rights and entitlements for our citizens which apply wherever they live within the UK. I know the system is devolved in Northern Ireland, but the reality is the flexibility the Northern Ireland executive has is quite limited. I place a strong value on the fact that we have an equal claim on that safety net, however imperfectly, that's there to protect us from beverages, 5 famous giant evils, and social security is one of the core components of our common citizenship, one of the great achievements of the UK. I wouldn't want to see that safety net fray as a result of ill-considered or rushed reforms, which seems to me is what we might get from Whitehall, particularly when it's bundled up in the English votes for English laws debate. A seductive argument, English votes for English laws. Try and work out what an English law is. A Welsh law is a law that passes through the National Assembly for Wales. A Scottish law passes through the Scottish Parliament. A Northern Ireland law passes through the Northern Ireland Assembly. England doesn't have a parliament, so what is an English law? Some might say, well, it's a law that only changes the law in England. Is it that easy? Let's say, for example, an incoming government decided that it would seek to privatise elements of the NHS. That would only affect England. The NHS bill that would follow would only affect England. The Act would only affect England. But if that led to a reduction in spending at the Department of Health, that affects Wales and Scotland, because there's a financial hit that was then taken by governments elsewhere in the UK. Is it then an English law? It's not as easy as it appears, however seductive the argument is. And to try to do that within the context of a UK Parliament is, to me, well nigh impossible. So when we talk about devolution in terms of the 3 smaller nations, let me be clear, we must address devolution for England too. The English question is as important, not as easy to answer because of the sheer size of England, but the answers have to be found over the course of the next few months and years, and I'll explain my view on that a little later. Now that brings me to my final point. Where are we headed? as a union. How do we get there? The key issue is cultural. There has to be a change of mindset at the centre. As I said earlier, we have to move from a devolution mindset to a new union mindset. A devolution mindset starts with the assumption that the Westminster Parliament is sovereign and that we are a fundamentally centralised state. That thinking has led us to making concessions by way of specific limited delegations to the devolved administrations. A new union mindset, on the other hand, declares that the UK is a state governed by 4 representative institutions. Those parliaments and assemblies embody popular sovereignty in each part of the UK and yet work with one another for the benefit of all who live in the UK. From that standpoint, the focus should be then on a realistic assessment of the benefits of the new union, on defining the powers which should be held at the centre, and of course looking at whether everything else should be decided locally with direct accountability at that level and transparency of decision making to the citizen. Now, on the day after the referendum, there were encouraging signs of a change of mindset. There was a recognition that the old union had been swept away. I never thought I would hear a Conservative Prime Minister say the UK is not a nation, it is 4. That shows you the way that things have changed. The Prime Minister recognised, at least at that point, the implications for the whole of the UK. He said that he wanted Wales to be at the heart of the debate. Music to my ears, but how real is that change? Only a few short weeks since the referendum, there's talk of opting out of the ECHR, talk of a new UK Bill of Rights. Now, today's not the day to have an argument or a debate on those issues, but of course the point is that such proposals are simply not within the gift of Westminster to deliver for the whole of the UK. The consent of the parliaments and the assemblies would be needed, and we made that point very clearly in the evidence we gave to the Commission on the Bill of Rights. Westminster has still not, in some aspects, woken up to the fundamental shift that was already underway before the referendum and has been magnified since the referendum. 3 weeks later, have the lessons been learned? Some of the rhetoric implies that it hasn't been learned. And I have to say that nothing will damage the union more than the reneging of the vow made in the Scottish campaign on the front page of the Daily Record. If that is not kept, I cannot think of something that would be more damaging to the union and to politics. And as somebody who has made a living in politics for the last 15 years, that would sadden me. That vow has to be delivered on. But we need some federal thinking in the UK. And we've not addressed questions of state structure and governance on the grounds of principle. In the summer, I was invited to speak at a conference of political scientists in Montreal, and that gave me an opportunity to talk about federalism in a UK context. Now, of course, federalism in the UK is often associated with what some see as the spectre of a centralised European super state located in Brussels. But we can look at it differently. As the Swiss socialist Andreas Gross observed, rather than constituting a model for an ever closer political union or a European state, federalism implies a process of balancing power in a differentiated political order which enables unity while guaranteeing diversity. Getting that balance right between solidarity and autonomy. That's what that means to me. Enabling unity while guaranteeing diversity is precisely the challenge that we face. Striking that balance. And federal thinking gets us to a new starting point to challenge the way that we've habitually viewed the state in years gone by. The old union starts the discussion in the wrong place because it starts with a presumption of centralisation and undivided sovereignty. By contrast, the new union starts from a premise of diversity and legitimacy of different tiers of government, similar to the Canadian model, pool sovereignty, as it's called in Canada. Now that we have democratic mandates at different national levels, we need to rethink where power lies and embrace multi-level sovereignty. Now, I'm not pretending that this is easy. These are complex issues. For the last 2 years, I've been putting forward the idea of a constitutional convention. It's become popular in the last few weeks. I welcome that. It's something I've repeated several times to the Prime Minister in recent days. I've suggested some outline terms of reference and stressed the importance of the convention being jointly owned and supported by the 4 governments. It will not work if it comes from Westminster alone. It defeats the entire point of having a constitutional convention. I look forward to the Prime Minister's reply. But the work can't stop there. To have true relevance and to break through the anti-politics sentiment that risks suffocating the established parties, we have to give ownership of the convention to the people of the UK. The last thing this can become is a stitch-up, or perceived to be a stitch-up, behind closed doors, which gives the impression that politicians are carving things up in their own interest. We have to avoid that at all costs. But a genuine refounding of the union, which I think is essential for its survival, must be done with society as a whole at the heart of the process. So, my argument is that the fundamental underpinning assumptions about the nature of our state have disappeared pretty much forever, but they haven't yet been adequately replaced. We need a process which will think through how our institutions of governance at union level can reflect that new reality. Of a UK which is an association of nations, self-governing in many key respects, but working together for our common good in a dangerous world, and as part, of course, of a sovereign state, but where sovereignty is distributed in a different way. We need to think about new and better mechanisms to enable our legislatures and governments to work together in a more effective way, on a basis of mutual respect. We have distinct identities within the UK, but we also have shared cultural and democratic values which can serve as a strong foundation for that new union. The task now is to think this through systematically in terms of our structures of governance. Working through those implications for the different levels of government and the different legislatures and the relationships they have with one another won't be straightforward. But I think that our best days can be ahead of us in terms of the UK. But there has to be an acceptance of the need for change, an acceptance of the reality that the way the union has been structured up until now will not last into the next century. For those of us who are committed to the UK and its existence and who want to remain part of the UK, I can tell you, I want to see a structure that serves us well in the future, that accommodates, recognises, and indeed celebrates the different national identities that we have, while of course ensuring that we have that social and economic common ground that we would all want to share. I think we have a unique opportunity over the course of the next few months in order to do that, and I look forward to working with other administrations elsewhere in the UK in order to build that new union. Thank you.
Carwyn, thank you very much indeed. Absolutely fascinating issues there. If I just take you through some of them before we open it up to questions. One of the key points you made was on the nature of the solidarity of the UK, and then you talked about some of the welfare state. Where do the boundaries lie? What is the essence of the solidarity? I mean, when Gordon Brown was Prime Minister and running up to it, he almost implied it was the health service and bits of work and pensions. What do you see as the essence of what has to be part of a UK-wide solidarity policy, as opposed to something where it makes sense to have diversity and distinctness?
There have to be common principles that underpin something that should be delivered at UK level, and there would have to be demonstrated a need to ensure that those principles meant that finances were redistributed across the UK, that people had equal access, for example, to social security. The NHS is not a British service anymore. It has at its heart the fundamental point of free at the point of delivery, but there are different policies across the UK. There are some areas to me that you would not want to see devolved. For me, the welfare state is one. Immigration clearly is another. Border control. Defence, we're not really looking to found a new army in Wales. There are certainly areas where it makes perfect sense that it should be a UK-wide responsibility. But instead of finding ourselves in a situation as we are now, where things have to be begrudgingly given to us, there should be an understanding that where it's demonstrated there's a popular will in one part of the UK for that power to rest in that part of the UK, that it happens. Not without any kind of scrutiny, but without delay, without prevarication. And we've had this. I mean, the UK government set up a commission called the Silk Commission to look at new powers for the Assembly. The Commission reported on the first part of its report, and it took over a year to get a response. That's just not good enough. And finding the mechanism where these things can be done more quickly is part of that process.
You raised something which is very current, because the legislation on that is going through the House of Lords at present. how much is what you talked about in your speech, in fact, superseding the Silk Parts 1 and 2 process? I mean, because you're looking ahead. I mean, it's rather like in Scotland, where they're implementing, well, legislation which was passed 2 years ago under the Calman process, but that is likely to be superseded. I mean, we saw the first instance when John Swinney announced the new property tax in Scotland. I mean, you're a bit further down the road, or sorry, behind in the road, but still in a rather traditional process, which you're criticising. But in a sense, in your speech, you're saying we need to leap ahead of that. We need to think of relations between the centre and the nations in a totally different light.
The problem is that devolution has been looked at in terms of a conversation between Westminster with Scotland in one room, Westminster and Wales in another room, and Westminster and Northern Ireland in yet another room. That bilateral process has to be superseded by a process where, well, let's take the convention. Convention, to my mind, would be the four governments sit down, work out what the convention should do, what it should look like, who should be on it, how it engages with people, and then look jointly at the recommendations that convention makes. To my mind, that's the sensible way of getting buy-in, both at government level and indeed at public level. That's not where we are. The devolution settlement in Wales is different to that in Northern Ireland and that in Scotland. We usually compare it against Scotland. In Scotland, what is not specifically reserved to Westminster is devolved. It's the opposite in Wales. Yeah. And what has that led to? 2 bills ending up in the Supreme Court, because nobody could be quite sure where the boundaries of competence actually lay. As it happened, the Supreme Court has done a wonderful job for us in terms of defining that competence, and we were successful in demonstrating that we had competence in those 2 areas. But any settlement that leads to bills ending up in the Supreme Court is not of itself robust. If it happened once in a while, you could say, well, yeah, there are reasons, there are areas that need to be explored. But this is a regular issue. We also have the problem in Wales where the Secretary of State for Wales can veto any Assembly bill. I mean, where does that lie in terms of being able to do that? It's not been done, but the fact it's there shows how difficult it can be when you have an elected legislature that's passed an act and it can be vetoed by a cabinet minister in London. These are all issues that need to be examined. Another issue, of course, is theoretical though this might be, it's still possible for the UK Parliament to abolish the devolved legislatures without even asking the people who live in those nations what their view is. Unlikely, I grant you, but should it be that at all in reality in the new union?
Well, it's an interesting issue on entrenchment, isn't that? I mean, whether you'd get to a position where what in Scotland are the sole powers of legislative consent are in practice a device for entrenchment for Scotland. That the idea of Westminster overriding an action of the Scottish Parliament, you're not in that position because the Secretary of State can veto. But that would, if you got to that position, that would amount to entrenchment, wouldn't it?
Yes, it would. But to me, we have to admit the perception that gives is an unfortunate one. That somehow in Wales you can't really be trusted to do anything sensible at all times. Therefore, we'll have this power in reserve to stop you doing it. That's not appropriate in the years to come.
Before coming on to convention, there's one interesting area which has come up in the recent debate, which is accepting even where something is funded centrally, is primarily regarded as there are UK-wide rights to it. You would have shared running of it. That the idea that, I mean, which you seem to be going towards in some areas, given there's such overlap, I mean, it's quite clear, I mean, from our own study of Wales that the 1998 legislation has been creaking in all kinds of ways. You've described some of the constitutional ways, but also in practical ways, because the division between local government and, say, DWT responsibilities are clashing all the time, and you're having to face that. That if you work towards a more shared running of services, would that make sense?
Well, we do that. I mean, we work very closely, for example, with NHS England, because people cross the border into Wales for treatment and people go the other way for treatment. Yeah. It makes perfect sense, and we have to pay each other. Yeah. So that system works very well. There are already some areas where agreement has to be obtained from all 4 administrations. For example, to appoint a new chair to the Food Standards Agency, that requires the agreement of 4, because it's funded by the 4 different administrations, and that works pretty well. There are examples of that working already. There are some areas, drawing on what you said, Peter, where executive competence has a strong case for devolution, but not legislative competence. Yeah, yeah. Civil contingencies being one example. You wouldn't want different legislative arrangements to deal with emergencies in different parts of the UK. It doesn't make any sense. It has to be consistent. But in terms of how those powers are exercised, it does make sense. So, for example, in Wales, civil contingencies not devolved. We've got no executive competence. But the problem is that whenever UK government looks at this issue, it forgets this. And so it will put in place structures that include organisations that don't exist in Wales. Now, we don't want that. We want to make sure that if there was ever a need to respond to an emergency, that there would be a smooth response, not an argument as to whether, well, someone would say, what are your PCTs doing? We say, we haven't got any. That's just the kind of thing, the kind of jagged edges the public would expect to be removed. So with civil contingencies, for example, it's much easier for us to arrange civil contingencies in Wales to provide the best level of response without trying to be so different from the rest of the UK in response that it causes difficulties for the entire island.
Now, on the Constitutional Convention, you say get the four the governments together. How broadly would you define the remit? Because looking at where there have been constitutional conventions elsewhere, they've often been on specific subjects. Australia had one on going the Republic. The Irish have had one recently on their constitution. You've had something on specific. Now, it may sound very specific, saying looking at relations within the UK. You can immediately get into the House of Lords and whether you want a Bundesrat of the second chamber, which actually represents the nations and the regions of England. You get into some quite big, and also Europe. You very quickly get into that. As you say, that, hold on, if people want to talk about either human rights or the EU, they run straight into the views of Cardiff too.
Yes, very true. With the House of Lords, one of the ideas I've put forward in years gone by is that the House of Lords should be made up, to my mind, elected in this way, but if not elected, in such a fashion that there's a greater recognition of the four nations in the UK, something vaguely along the lines of the US Senate, where geography trumps population to provide some balance. There is a difficulty with that argument because people will then say, are you saying that the House of Lords would be a second chamber for the Assembly? That's not what I'm saying. So there are issues that would need to be resolved there. But fundamentally, what the Convention needs to do is to look at structure, not so much powers. Powers can run along a separate track. What we need to do is get the structure right in terms of who does what. And we're not there at that moment in time. So, for example, you might say, okay, these are all the powers that exist at different levels of government. They're in this box. Out of that box, we need to provide a mechanism where those powers can be devolved at the request of the appropriate devolved administration, with, of course, some scrutiny from Westminster. We don't have that. There are three different systems. Some move more quickly than others. Scotland gets promises made to it at the drop of a hat. In Wales, we have to wait more than a year. And that clearly is not something that we'd want to see persist in the future.
Yeah. How would you also mentioned, and this seems to be a really big issue with the Constitutional Convention, is to avoid the accusations of stitch-up. That, you've got the Westminster parties, you've also got the parties, very different range of parties, in the devolved capitals. What about the public? What role should they
have to be involved? Look, the problem that exists in politics now is that much of the population has turned off politics. I think one of the things I'm very careful to do is when I speak to people, actually use normal language. I think that's a help. And try to live your life outside of the political bubble when you can. I live in the town that I represent. My kids are in the local school. It's thankfully got a normal life. I don't have to spend half my life in London. And I welcome that personally. Of course, others, their view will be different. But the convention would have to outline how it would engage with the public. I've just used the word engage. I said I wouldn't do that. How it would listen to the public.
Yeah.
What do people think out there? What do they want to see that the future shape of the UK be? Because if people think they're being presented with something that they know nothing about, or they've had no consultation on, that they're not aware of, then immediately that process is undermined. It can be done. Look at Scotland. The turnout was mid-80s% in terms of the referendum vote. Scotland did it. We in the rest of the UK need to learn lessons as to how that was done, and make sure that level of public engagement carries on in the future. What
about the elephant, England? Because a lot of there's a heightened political discussion. Obviously in Scotland, you say, with the turnout, the referendum. it's pretty well developed in Wales too. I mean, you know, the turnout hasn't been so great, but when you've had the various referendums, but there is an awareness of the debate, at least at certain levels. In England, it is incredibly patchy and uneven. There isn't a defined... Is it possible to have your convention without at least a defined view of what should happen to England?
No, and that's why the convention has to address England as well. The English question is the hardest question of all to answer. It's fairly straightforward for Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. But what do you do with England? It's so big, so dominant within the UK. Do you have an English parliament? I'm not sure that's got public support. Do you have greater devolution at regional level? An unfortunate history. Do you try to devolve at levels such as the 10 local authorities in Greater Manchester? These questions have to be teased through. They have to be worked through, and there's no easy answer to them, which is why you need a convention process in order to do that. My great worry is that when we talk about powers within the UK, we should not marginalise people who live in the north of England, who live in the Midlands, who might feel equally as distant from Westminster, and it's important their voices are heard as well. Which is why I've never talked about, I will put Wales's position and Wales's case, but I always try to see it through a UK spectrum and say what we need is a settlement for the whole UK, not just purely looking at Wales without regard to what happens elsewhere in the UK, because in order to get that stability for the future, it has to be a UK settlement, and that includes listening to the voices of people who live in all parts of England.
I mean, there must be a practical thing for you, because looking at the Welsh border with England, let alone the Irish Sea or whatever, you've got three big conurbations nearby. Liverpool, Birmingham isn't that far, but the whole West Midlands and Bristol. And how do you relate actually in practice? Because you've got to do business with them all. I mean, you're dealing business with, obviously, on the airports with Bristol and so on, as you're trying to revive Cardiff.
That's normal.
Yeah, but there aren't the comparable levels of authority for you to deal with, are there yet?
That is true. I mean, one thing I have to say is the abolition of the RDAs in England were a gift to us, because the competition vanished, to be honest with you. I mean, it's... we have the ability to go abroad. We've got offices abroad. We can project ourselves abroad. The English regions don't have that. You know, it's to our great advantage. It's not to their advantage, I have to say. And it's right that there is nobody there. There's no organisation whose job it is to say, come and invest in the southwest of England. It's not there. And that you know, I have to say to us, has been a great advantage. But you know, looking at it from a UK perspective, it can't be a good thing. In terms of a comparative level of government, no, that's true. But you know, it's possible to work with Bristol at municipal level and with Manchester and with Birmingham. Things can be done to get around that. But of course, you know, we're in a much stronger position in terms of being able to deliver than a local authority would be, given the limited powers of local authorities. But you know, there's no. I think sometimes on the island of Great Britain, we seem to think that somehow, if you have a border, it is something that is set in stone that can't be crossed. But it's not the case elsewhere in Europe. And I'm very familiar with the border between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland. It's completely porous. There's a motorway through it between Dublin and Newry, and people, you know, they're used to it, and it's invisible to all intents and purposes for areas like transport, for example. You know, that can be done between, you know, the UK and the Republic of Ireland. It can easily be done in terms of Wales and England.
Looking at the timescale, UK general election next May, it's questionable how much will be settled before then in practice. We'll have proposals on Scotland. How are you realistically believing you'll get much beyond the current legislation going through for Wales before the election?
No, not through Parliament. We'd like to see the Wales bill through, but all four parties in the Assembly have called for the UK government to come forward with proposals for legislation for Wales by January. Not legislation through Parliament,
well, no,
clearly,
that's not practical.
But proposals. They're doing it with Scotland, and that's meant to be by the end of this
and
month. So for Wales, January it's not unreasonable.
No, and therefore to be passed by the Westminster Parliament before your elections in May 2016. That'd be a tight call.
I mean, realistically, it would be very difficult to. Some powers can be devolved by orders in council fairly easily. Yeah. Powers that would need primary legislation, clearly, practically it's going to be difficult to do that before our elections in May of 2016. You're looking at a point beyond that. Just
finally, before opening up, you used the word settlement once. I mean, I don't know whether it was a slip of the tongue almost, because the one thing that strikes me about Wales, certainly for the last few years, and certainly, obviously, about Scotland and in a more opaque way about Northern Ireland is the one thing there isn't is a settlement. You know, there is a process. Is there ever, if you got what you wanted, would we be talking about a settlement, or will that only occur when we've had the convention and a new view of intergovernmental relations, a new union, as you describe it, because it's a very different body, a very different concept, a way of thinking, a way of behaving than we've seen so far?
It would mean a settlement accepted by the majority. Yeah. You're not going to get everybody to agree. There are some in Wales who would prefer us to be an independent state. About 10% of the population want to return to direct rule. You know, you've got those two extremes, and those people are never going to be satisfied. But the vast majority of people, the 80% in the middle, what they, I think, would look for is something that is lasting, not something that has to be revisited every 4 or 5 years or so.
Right, let's open it up to questioning. We've got mics here. Two gentlemen in front of you, Lauren. And could you say who you are first?
Yes, David Hill, University of Aberdeen. You've already referred about the dominance of England within the United Kingdom, but things are even more complicated because Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland have proportional representation both for the parliaments and for local government, whereas there's not proportional representation in English local government, and even more importantly so at Westminster. With a 4 or 5 party system, it makes Westminster elections very unpredictable, and so the kind of moves by the UK government are much more difficult than they otherwise might be.
True, I mean, we don't have PR and local government in Wales, but we do have, of course, an element of PR as part of our election system. I mean, we believe that actually we should control our electoral system, not have it imposed on us. With safeguards. I mean, you wouldn't want the whole system changed on the strength of one vote, clearly, but you know, that in principle has to be right. I mean, the election next year, if you look at the opinion polls, it could be very difficult to predict, you know, the outcome. That much is true. But that doesn't mean that there can't be general agreement between parties across the spectrum as to what the future should be. UKIP, until recently, saw devolution as a European plot. That's what they would call it. They were rabidly, they wanted to abolish the Assembly and the Scottish Parliament without even a vote. That was their position. Now they want a federal UK. So, you know, that shows that the way their position has changed. We are able, and we've just laid down a motion for debate in the Assembly next week, we are able to put down a joint motion with the Conservatives, with Plaid Cymru, with the Liberal Democrats, because we've found common ground upon which we can all agree. It's not beyond us in Cardiff, it shouldn't be beyond the parties in London.
Right. David.
David Walker, Guardian Public. Devolution goes 2 ways. You've got an issue in Wales with the quality and perhaps even the structure of local government. From the north in Ysmond to the south in the valleys, there are big questions about the capacity of Welsh local government, and which you know far better than I in detail. Do you not need to say something, if not here then in Wales, about what would happen as we move haltingly down this road to the relationship between the Welsh Assembly government and local government in Wales, which may already be unfit for purpose?
Well, the Williams Commission, which reported a few months ago, recommended that we should move from 22 local authorities to between 10 and 12. We haven't taken a final decision yet on what the final number should be, but there's no question that many of our authorities find it very difficult. They're so small. Merthyr Tydfil, population just over 50,000, and they're required as a unitary authority to look after education, social services, in an area that is one of those areas with the greatest need, with a council tax base that's lower than, for example, Western or Northern Cardiff. That in itself is unfair. We have 22 social services departments for a population of 3 million, 22 trading standards departments for a population of 3 million, 22 local education authorities for 3 million. That's not a practical settlement for the future. What I'd like to do is to get to the point where we have far fewer local authorities that are stronger, that have more critical mass, and are able to deliver the kind of services that people would want. So the question you asked, David, is what is happening? We've had the Williams Commission, we have those recommendations, we'll now move them forward.
Yep, gentleman there.
Hi, Stuart McNaughton from Progress. I just wondered firstly what your thoughts are on, there's been a couple of Labour MPs calling for an English Labour Party, and I wonder what your thoughts are on that and whether you think it would help promote what you discussed as moving from a devolutionary mindset to a new union mindset. And secondly, just very quickly, I wonder what your thoughts are on reports this morning that the Labour Party would boycott the English Votes for English laws discussions that are taking place at the moment.
Well, first of all, I think the current discussions on what are called English votes for English laws are farcical because it's being done in reaction to Scotland rather than being done sensibly. And I don't think it is that easy to identify. Who decides what an English law is? Is it the government of the day? Is it the Speaker? What if there's an effect on Wales and Scotland subsequently that affects our finances? Not that easy. If there's an institution called an English Parliament, you can run English laws through it. That creates its own issues, I understand that. But I really don't think you can have an institution where different members have different voting rights. You know, that's a very tough question to look at. And simply doing it, you know, we'll just introduce it tomorrow or next week is just the wrong way of doing it and could only create problems. An English Labour Party, England's big. You would need to regionalise within that structure. But of course, one of the challenges all parties face, apart from the nationalist parties, in May next year is how to run the general election campaign. Because if parties make pledges, as they will, about health, education, housing, they're all devolved. So how do you run an election campaign when you're saying these are our main pledges, or they don't apply to Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, incidentally? And that's a challenge for all parties, how you run an election campaign in that way. From my point of view, I would, within the Labour Party, I'd favour greater devolution within the party itself, but of course we have to make sure that we keep that common bond of principles that we share within the party.
Right, two questions. Alan, just.
Accepting as I do that without, so long as the Barnett formula is retained, there's no prospect of an acceptable or stable new model federal union. But even with your fallback position of providing a funding floor for Wales, aren't there still some very formidable political difficulties in the way of achieving that? Given that public expenditure is a zero-sum game, more for Wales means less elsewhere, and not least in the context of austerity, there's growing recognition in parts of England that Barnett's a lousy deal. So it's going to be a very difficult tussle, isn't it?
It is. I don't think... It's very difficult to make a logical case for the retention of Barnett as it is. It's based on data that originated in the 1970s, and it's true to say that Wales loses out at the last count to the tune of £300 million a year, but it's also true, of course, that English regions lose out as well. Now, from my point of view, what I want to see is a fair funding settlement for Wales and a fair funding settlement across the whole of the UK. And to my mind, that has to be addressed in the longer term, at the very least, by a needs-based assessment, which is not what we have at the moment. In the meantime, selfishly, I'd say, fine, as long as we've got the money in Wales, then we're fine. But in terms of looking at it in the UK context, there's no getting away from the fact that at some point in time, there's going to have to be an examination of Barnett.
What about leading on from that? Something you did touch on, I meant to explore it, on taxes, where you raise the possibility of some taxes being possibly coming to Cardiff. Looking at the two examples of Scotland, which are in a sense locally based taxes. I mean, you put the argument, very, very persuasively against corporation tax being devolved because you lead to a competition at the bottom. But some taxes, like the property-based taxes, completely localised taxes. Would you, did you look at what John Swinney was saying last Thursday with envy and thinking, right, you'd like those powers?
We're having them.
Yeah.
It's part of the Wales Bill.
Yeah. All of them? Are you having both powers?
Devolution of stamp duty is part of the Wales Bill. Landfill tax, arrogance levy.
But not
landfill tax.
But not the income tax.
Arrogance levy, provided that a state aids issue can be resolved. Yeah. Income tax is in the bill, but at the moment there's a lockstep arrangement which isn't particularly useful as part of the bill. There are limits on it, and there's a need for a referendum, but that's part of the bill. Now, with stamp duty, it's fairly easy to take over a property tax. Property doesn't move. The reality is, for us in Wales, if we were to have income tax varying powers, there would be a natural break on how those powers could be applied, given the fact that people can go and live over the border.
Yeah.
It's actually something the Republic of Ireland have to consider.
Yeah.
When they look at fuel duty, they have to think about the difference between them and Northern Ireland because of the fact that so many people live within reach of garages in Northern Ireland. And one of the things I did see at one time was when there was a major difference in fuel prices between the UK and the Republic of Ireland, where diesel particularly was substantially cheaper in the Republic, all the garages closed on the northern side of the border for obvious reasons. So there are always natural breaks on these things in any event. But for me, in Wales, we could not take a power that would leave us financially worse off by locking in underfunding that's already there. You can't build it on false foundations. It has to be based on firm foundations. Then you can start saying, well, there has to be an element then of tax varying powers. What I don't think works, frankly, and I know it's been talked about in the context of Scotland, is full income tax varying powers. I don't see how that works in terms of the issue of solidarity. I don't see how that works in terms of being able to keep Barnett funding and have full income tax powers. And that's a fantastic deal if you can get it. But there has to be, in any union, there has to be a mechanism to ensure that money is redistributed according to where it's needed. If you have full control over income tax varying powers in any one part of that union, that's broken. Partial flexibility, fine, as long as you keep that pan-UK redistributive element. Yeah. Full flexibility, and that element goes. And those areas that can raise the least have less money for public services.
But in a sense, with a single capital, labour and product markets, that does impose very strict restrictions on, as you say, the obvious one is with indirect taxation. But equally, that if you varied income tax, say at the higher rates very much, you can see the movements between the Wirral and Flintshire and equally across the Severn Bridge.
Yeah, you would. I mean, and of course, we know full well if there was to be a significant difference, for example, in the higher rate of tax, then people would just move. People can't move houses physically across the border. Not that we're looking at imposing punitive taxes when it comes to stamp duty, but that's something that has to be accepted. There are other areas where, let's take, for example, employment law. I wouldn't want to see that devolved. I know it is in Northern Ireland, but I wouldn't want to see that devolved. I'd rather see a good level of protection for working people across Europe, actually. Ideally, it should be a European issue, not just within the UK. So I wouldn't see, for example, any advantage in us having our own system of employment regulation. I wouldn't see any advantage to Wales, for example, of having our own completely self-contained system of civil justice. It's important for our lawyers, and I was a lawyer once, important for our lawyers to be able to access the English courts, because the English courts are quite often the preferred mode of settlement in any contract.
But there are moves on the legal and judicial system to give more control.
Well, we have this odd scenario where England and Wales, to my mind, is the only legal jurisdiction where there are two legislatures in the same jurisdiction. In the States, there are different jurisdictions, the States on the one hand and federal on the other. We have this odd scenario. So from a legal point of view, it's quite an odd settlement, but it kind of works at the moment. From my point of view, I think it's inevitable in time that there will be a Welsh jurisdiction along the lines of Northern Ireland, not Scotland. I mean, we would not be so much difference that it caused problems. Northern Ireland is effectively a parallel jurisdiction. It's a common law jurisdiction. It's administratively different, but in reality, the legal principles are very much the same, even if the legislation may not be. So I wouldn't want to see that. But in terms, for example, of criminal justice, you could devolve criminal justice. Major piece of devolution, because we don't have, obviously, within Welsh government, the level of expertise to deal with it. We'd have to build that up, because we don't deal with criminal justice as a rule. And that would have to be weighed up carefully. What does it mean in terms of the cost? What does it mean in terms of what the lead-in time might be? Some areas you can devolve fairly easily. You can devolve energy consenting easily. We can do that now. Other areas are not so easy. So even where there's an argument for devolving something, there has to be that lead-in period.
Yes, you've got a weather window now, the Welsh Lord Chief Justice, of course.
We have.
Who is very sensitive to these issues.
He is. No, he is. And one of the great changes has been, of course, that when I was in practice, there was a Lord Chief Justice of England, and now it's England and Wales.
Indeed. Gentleman there.
Thank you. Hugh Lloyd, Labour Coast Country. You've touched on the devolution, in a sense, of finance, of delivery, and some of the decision-making processes. But most of the conversation, even when you put your sort of new union hat on, is still about the aggregations of cities and or between Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland and England. Wales has the good fortune to have community councils that cover every part of it, unlike England with only parish and town councils in perhaps a third. What sort of powers should they get that would make the engagement of people, and I appreciate you don't like that word, but actually involving people in their communities and their places? What powers could they get that would make Wales work better?
Well, once you sort out the unitary authorities, you can then start looking at the level below. We don't have community councils in all parts of Wales. For example, the Rhondda hasn't got any at all. There are also enormous differences in size between them. In my own constituency, the biggest community council is not far short of 20,000, the smallest has 300. Now, short of fundamentally reorganising the entire system in order to give them more powers, the other alternative is to say, right, we will tier community councils according to their size, according to what their capacity is, and devolve powers accordingly to them. There are some town councils who are big enough to exercise powers a little short of the old UDCs, but something close. There are other community councils, basically I was a member of one, much smaller. Basically we dealt with allotments of footpaths, and that was pretty much what we could do. Some of the other councils are much, much bigger. So I see this as a system where you deal with the unitary authorities first, you get that right in terms of the structure, then you look at community and town councils and empowering them, but empowering them in terms of them being able to deal with the powers that they get, and that means looking at them and putting them in different categories and giving them powers according to what they'll be able to handle.
Right. Gentleman there.
My name is Olof Samuelsson from the Embassy of Sweden here in London. I was wondering, I understood that the question of an English parliament is neither an easy one or a popular one. But how would you solve the issue of the new union and the concept of the English question without an English parliament?
It can't be done easily, as I said. You need to have a convention process, getting the public involved, getting ideas to do that. But really, if you look at it in isolation of the politics, you could create an English parliament. You could create strong devolved regional assemblies within England. You could look at empowering certain areas of local government in England, it's basically taking the approach in England that I suggested in terms of community councils in Wales. All these things have to be looked at carefully. What you can't do is simply say, oh, we'll have English rules and English laws in some vague way, and then we'll start doing it in a few months' time. That is precisely the wrong way of doing it, and that can only lead to problems in terms of the unity of the UK.
Yeah, gentleman there next to.
Yes. My name's Hugh Edwards. How far do you need to communicate with Whitehall, with Stephen Crabb, about what you intend to do, what you're doing? Do you need to talk to him, personally or on telephone several times a week, or does Whitehall leave you to get on with it, and the interaction isn't really very much? How far does your staff communicate with Whitehall?
Well, in the main, of course, the powers that we have, we exercise freely. There's no Whitehall control over those powers. Stephen and I will touch base at least once a month, and more when the occasion arises. The relationship between the Wales office and the Welsh Government now is better than it certainly was the previous incumbents, if I'm honest. And Stephen I think has a good understanding. His politics are very different to mine, but he's a good understanding of what's needed in terms of the constitutional future. As I said, where there is common ground between political parties in terms of where we should go with the constitution, there's no reason why we can't work together in order to deliver that. And the conversations I've had with Stephen on this and other issues have been useful conversations.
Gentleman here.
Thank you. John Newham, teacher of politics. The Constitution's obviously in great flux at the moment. I just wonder whether the long-term answer is some form of federalism.
That's one answer. The problem with federalism is, again, what do you do with England? If you had a relative, if you didn't have, in the States, there is no one state that's entirely dominant in terms of population, but that's not the case in the UK. Federalism is one answer, but again, you have to sort out what happens in England in order for federalism to work. But it's a possibility. But again, we come back to this point. What does it mean for England? How do we ensure the people of England don't feel left out? How do we ensure that people in England feel that they're part of this process, that they feel they have an equal say in the future of the UK? All these things are important. That's why we can't see it purely in terms of Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, without thinking about what it means for England as well. And that's important to us in Wales, and no doubt important for people in England itself.
What about London? Because in a sense,
The
one part, well indeed, with the mayor pressing for more powers, particularly in some of the tax areas we've been discussing, more than he's got. But in a curious way, the one part, you can argue the northwest, but the one part of England which has got a very defined regional sense is London.
That's very true. There's a template there, I think, for other parts of the UK. The problem was, of course, is that the London mayoralty and the Assembly was set up with popular acclaim. By the time the referendum took place in the northeast of England, the momentum was gone. Yeah. And ever since then, things have just been buried, or they've disappeared off the agenda. You know, London's very different, of course, in its structure. London has control of policing. We don't at the moment. On the other hand, London doesn't control its planning system in terms of planning law. It doesn't have a separate system of appeals. It's not going to be a primary legislature in that sense. But it might prove an interesting template as to how power might be shifted to other parts of England as part of this discussion.
One thing which we haven't touched on is Europe. The degree to which you would seek a voice in conjunction with the UK government in Europe on specifically issues, you know, which affect Wales.
We do. I mean, we've got.
But I mean, you have a consultation one, but you want a stronger one, because that's looking at Nicola Sturgeon's paper on Friday. She's arguing for a much more distinct Scottish voice than the kind of cooperative model which exists at present.
Well, of course, what we can't do is have a seat at the table of the Council of Ministers. We know that. But nevertheless, there's been a good history of working together across the UK. I was Rural Affairs Minister, and the beauty of being Rural Affairs Minister is that EU policy had to be agreed by all 4 administrations, because we all control our own subsidy regimes, and that was quite we'd have a meeting once a month and we'd work things through. It worked very well. We have our own office in Brussels, as Scotland does. UK is quite happy for us to have a relationship with the Commission without the intervention of the UK. The quid pro quo is we don't actively undermine the UK and its position with regard to a particular issue. We will make sure the Commission knows that there is a Welsh position on any particular issue. We work well with ACREP, and it's never been an issue for us. We've never had a real problem in terms of UK taking a position having not talked or listened to the devolved administration. So I think it's worked quite well, and it's an example of how that can be rolled out to other parts of government as well.
Which particular other parts of government do you see a need for that to happen?
Well, let's look at the Joint Ministerial Council. It meets regularly. It has a plenary session every year. It has tended to become a forum for grievances. It's not really what it should be. I mean, there will be disputes. There is a disputes resolution process where if there's a dispute with the Treasury, there's a process and the Treasury actually decides the dispute, but there we are. And it needs to move away from that. It could be a very useful machine for governments working together, for working through some of the issues. I'll give you one issue that we had to deal with, and that was the issue of the health levy that was proposed, where people wanted to get a visa to enter the UK, they would have to pay £200 to pay for healthcare. First point I made was, okay, that's going to be a part of a consequential, is it? No. I hadn't thought that through. I said, well, hang on a second, you're going to charge people for healthcare, and then you're saying you're not going to give them money to Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, where the healthcare system is devolved. Just blank. And that's one example of how that can be worked through, but really, they should have realised this to begin with. It's an obvious argument that if you charge someone for healthcare, which is itself devolved, and that money has to follow it has to go to the healthcare systems that are devolved. But I'd like to see it become much more active. I'd like to see it become much more of a case of governments working together rather than UK sits there and the rest of us sit on this side of the table and it's us versus them. That's not the way things should work. It's had a tendency to move in that direction. in the last 2 years particularly, I'd say, needs to get away from that.
Does that also involve a commitment of high-level political participation on the part of Westminster, of Whitehall? I mean, by ministers.
Yeah, it does. I mean, I've been concerned. Well, two things have troubled me a little, in the sense that in the past few years, the JMC, the Prime Minister turns up once a year. First Minister of Scotland attended less and less, and it was beginning to lose its momentum. British Irish Council is the same. The UK quite often will send somebody quite low ranking as the UK government's representative. The Taoiseach is always there.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, once you start with that process, the whole mechanism becomes undermined. You have to take these things seriously, and the JMC to me should be a meeting of governments, between heads of government, you know, every week or every month, but at least once a quarter, to work through some of these issues. It's not there at the moment, and it should be there. Why? It helps the UK work better. And for those of us who want to see the UK continue, that's got to be a good thing.
Now, just, yeah, Alan, you could have a mini question.
Supposing
You've got a mic behind you. Yeah.
Supposing in 2017 there's an in-out referendum across the United Kingdom on membership of Europe, and a majority in the United Kingdom vote to come out, but a majority in Wales vote to stay in, what then follows?
A constitutional difficulty. I mean, this is a real issue, Alan, as you know. I mean, let's take Scotland as an example. One of the main issues in the Scottish referendum was uncertainty over EU membership. If the UK decides to leave the EU, there is an argument for saying there should be another referendum in Scotland, because one of the big issues has just disappeared and would have to be revisited. So there is that as well. Scotland is more Europhile than Wales. Wales is more Europhile than England. That's you know, we always sit in the middle of these things, but that's the reality of it. For us, being a member of the two unions is essential to our economy. We have big employers in Wales. You look at Airbus, you look at Ford, General Electric, Tata Steel, to name but a few. They are European operations. Anything that interferes with that European operation will mean that they will invest in the future inside the European market, not outside of it. When I go to other countries, one of the first things I'll be asked is, of course, you know, it'll be said to me, Wales is, of course, a member of the EU. They're not interested in a market of 3 million. They're not interested in a market of 60 million. They are interested in a market of 500 million. And it's our ability to provide a base for unfettered access into the European market that is absolutely crucial to our economy. Our farmers would collapse without the subsidies, that's true, but also our manufacturing industry, if there was any suggestion of any barrier being placed between us and the rest of Europe, we'd lose jobs. No question of it, we'd lose jobs. And if at some point the argument was made, well, you know, we voted to stay in, Scotland voted to stay in, England voted to take us out, and you know, now we have to leave. You can see the scenario occurring where people say, well, you know, which union do we belong to then? And to my mind, I want to belong to both.
Yeah, I mean, you said you didn't want to use technical language. I think you did use the word difficulty, which was understatement of what would happen.
It was a diplomatic answer.
Diplomatic answer. Very interesting in Scotland. The evidence shows that the strongest yes voters were also the most Eurosceptic. It was wonderful because the clear linkages were with degree of deprivation and that, and the yes vote. I mean, there's absolutely clear linkage, and also the most Eurosceptic, paradoxically. Now, that might settle out very differently in an actual referendum. But
it's curious, because I think what we saw in Scotland is a lot of the yes voters were people who are attracted by UKIP in England.
yeah,
They're people who are voting to register a protest, at least, against the system as they see it. I mean, you know, the SNP it wants to, you can call it a separatist party, so is UKIP. UKIP is as separatist as the SNP or Plaid Cymru, in the sense of wanting to be separate from the EU, and elements of UKIP being particularly interested in English independence. You know, we certainly come across that. And I think you're right. There were numbers of yes, you know, a fair number of yes voters who basically took the view, things are bad for us, how can they get worse? And that is not a good place for the UK to be in. And the key for those of us who want to see the UK stay together over the next 10 or 20 years is to make sure that those people feel they're part of the system, whether they vote yes in Scotland or whether they vote for UKIP in England.
Just one final question. Looking at timescales, I mean, you yourself say that you would like to see early New Year a package of fresh proposals going beyond the silk process, which in partly is a parallel with Calman in Scotland and so on, to towards a new union. Then, Ed Miliband's talking about if he's Prime Minister next May, and then Constitutional Convention this time next year. He looks rather hurried, without a clear English viewpoint.
The problem is the election.
Yeah.
Of course, and it is, I know it's difficult for parties to work together as an election approaches. I think beginning the convention process after the election is a reasonable timetable. I think Ed is right in that regard. That doesn't mean, of course, that moving forward with powers has to be delayed because of the convention. It comes back to the point I made earlier, that the convention can look at structure, powers can run parallel. What I wouldn't want to see is the convention process delaying the devolution of further powers, because the answer would be, well, we'll just wait for the convention to report. Yeah. But the convention should look at much more fundamental issues, such as structure. What does the UK look like? Is parliamentary sovereignty fit for the 21st century, or are there other models like Canada? Those are the questions the convention could look at.
Pretty big questions.
That's why it can't be done overnight. Which is what we need to avoid being done in Westminster or in Whitehall. Well,
I can guarantee that the Institute for Government will be part of that debate. Carwyn Jones, thank you very much indeed. An absolutely fascinating speech. Also, your candour in, I shouldn't say candour, that's a very dangerous thing to say.
Don't say bravery. Don't say brave. No,
bravery. It answered the questions. And also a reminder, which is, I say, we don't have to do here, but in London is necessary, of the Welsh part of the union debate, which I think is very important. You've been making these points for some time, but in the context now, getting on for a month on, from the Scottish referendum, this broadening of debate. And I'm very grateful for you coming here to the Institute today. This is part of a debate we intend to be part of, and also to engage you and your government in the future. Thank you very much indeed.